Hello and welcome to Sophie & Co. I'm Sophie Shevardnadze. The Scottish bid for independence was defeated at the polls in September. However, the Scottish National Party is still in power and is refusing to abandon its hope for sovereignty. What's next for the independence movement? Well, the driving force behind the referendum, former First Minister Alex Salmond, is my guest today.
Promises of broad powers from London helped keep the UK intact in the Scottish independence vote. But now that the battle seems to be won, will Westminster stay true to its word? Can the UK afford to share powers with the rest of Scots? And what will it risk if its vows don't go further than its words?
Alex Salmond, former First Minister of Scotland, welcome to our show. It's great to have you with us again. Now, Mr. Salmond, for 15 years you've been working towards this referendum. Just getting there was already an achievement. But tell me something. When, at what moment exactly that night on September 18th did you realize it was all over and that you lost the independence vote?
Well, I don't think it's all over, but when I realised we'd lost the vote on September the 18th was when the first result came through. Late on into the evening, towards midnight, when the first result came through from the first declaration. Once that happened, I realised we were going to fall a few percentage points short. I also realised, of course, that the result was going to be much closer than anybody in London had realised when we set up the referendum. So, on the one hand, obviously, I was disappointed we didn't win the vote. On the other hand, I knew that we'd turned in a very powerful performance with 1.6 million Scots saying yes to independence.
But looking back right now, what was it you think you personally did wrong during this latest attempt at independence?
Oh, I mean, any campaign will have very strong points, and our strong point in the campaign was we mobilised hundreds of thousands of people who'd never previously been interested in politics. Hence, we had an 85% poll, a 98% registration, almost unprecedented in democratic politics. Where we had miscalculated, underestimated, was the impact of a last-minute offer from the London government and the opposition parties, the three leaders of the Westminster parties, the three amigos, as we call them in Scotland, who said that if Scotland voted no, there would still be extensive powers given to the Scottish people. And that, in the last few days of the campaign, was enough to swing that vital 10% of people who were thinking about voting yes into voting no, because they believed that power would come to Scotland even after a no vote. Now the task is now to make sure is that promise, that vow as it was called, is redeemed and Scotland gets what we were promised in the referendum campaign.
Mm-hmm. But when you walk in the streets now, what do people say to you when they see you? Interesting
enough, when I walk in the streets now, I get queues of people looking for selfies. Incidentally, nothing makes you more popular than resigning. If the selfie count is anything to go by, I'm now more popular than having resigned as First Minister than I was when I was in office. So being in the street is something I love doing, of course, because I love the public and the people's approachability that we have in Scotland. But it's a very long process walking anywhere in the streets of Scotland at the present moment. It takes quite a while getting from A to B because the selfie count has reached astronomical proportions.
But except the selfie, do they say anything? Do they say thank you, for example, or something else?
Actually, thank you is a lot of people just say that, and it's very moving. I've been in politics a long time, and I've seen a few things in politics, and you're not easily moved by things. But actually, when people come up to you, as two women did today, incidentally, women who had told me they had never been the slightest bit interested in politics in their lives, and all they wanted to say was thank you because they'd got interested in the political process. They'd seen a glimpse of a different future for themselves and for their country. And when people say that to you, it actually is very moving. It's very difficult not to be touched by that sort of feeling, that sort of rapport. So it is moving, it is fundamentally moving, and I'm delighted because I think despite the fact that we lost the referendum, I think Scotland is now a much better place than it was before the referendum experience. It's now a politically energised, empowered population, and I hope we can keep that going because as I said on the day I resigned on September the 19th, that despite the defeat in the referendum, I think that Scotland can still emerge as a winner from this process.
We're going to talk about where Scotland stands right now, but just before that, I remember before the vote, there was a lot of negative campaigning against you in the press with allegations of corruption, etc. We even got a glimpse of it here in Russia. Who do you think was behind it?
Well, I mean, look, when you take on the British establishment, you must expect them to go in for underhand tactics. And of course, there was lots of negative campaigning, fear-mongering. But I don't think the negative campaigning actually paid off. If anything, I think that consolidated the yes support. What was decisive for the no campaign, for the Westminster parties, for Prime Minister Cameron, opposition leader Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister, when they joined together along with the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who unlike the three Westminster leaders still has some credibility in Scotland, and said, look, here's an offer of huge powers that you'll get from a no vote. That then was a decisive moment in the campaign. So the negative campaign is what you expect. You know, that's the sort of stuff that the London establishment does. But the offer, the vow as it was called, was the thing that decided the campaign.
So at which moment in the campaign do you feel David Cameron's conduct was dignified and when wasn't it?
Well, I think the Prime Minister emerged very badly from the referendum campaign. Obviously, 10 days before, the very first opinion poll ever showed the Yes campaign in the lead. So for the first time, there was an opinion poll which showed the Yes side ahead by 1%, by 51% to 49%. But that achieved the result of engendering some panic in the heart of the Westminster government. I don't think that was particularly edifying. I mean, what David Cameron did was he called a lot of big companies into Downing Street. He asked them, told them, encouraged them to make negative comments about Scottish independence. So you had big oil companies, big supermarkets making negative statements. I don't think that's particularly edifying. I don't think it was particularly effective either. Then, of course, there was this offer to Scotland of substantially more powers, which was more effective. And then, of course, the moment where David Cameron snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, where the day after the referendum, he emerged from Downing Street, and instead of saying, you know, we'll now endorse, we'll now deliver the commitment we made to Scotland, no questions asked, no strings attached, he said something quite different. He said, yes, of course, there'll have to be changes in Scotland, but they must proceed at the same pace as, or as he put it, in tandem with, changes in England. Now, that was the first time that had been mentioned. It wasn't mentioned in the campaign. And in doing that, he did himself a great disservice. And of course, what we've seen since the referendum, with the SNP surging in the opinion polls in Scotland, has a great deal to do with how David Cameron conducted himself in victory. It's one thing, incidentally, in politics and life, being a bad loser. Being a bad winner, which is what David Cameron was, is something else entirely. And he's paying a heavy price for that lack of grace, that lack of ability to not just accept a democratic result, but also to go forward on the commitments that he'd given without strings attached.
So you feel like the language of love that were spoken, the words of love that were spoken towards Scotland, is kind of fading away?
Well, the offer that was given, the offer in the vow is not being redeemed. They set up a committee under a very excellent person, Robert Smith, and that produced a report. But the report itself does not match the promises that were made. What Scotland was promised, it was home rule, which is a word in politics in which was applied first to Ireland and to India in the days of British Empire. And what that means is you control all domestic taxation and domestic legislation. That's not an offer. The words that were used were devil to the max by the newspaper, the Daily Record, which the largest selling paper at one time in Scotland, which articulated the vow, and that means all control, all financial control in Scotland. That's not an offer. Or as Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, said, near federalism. And it's not federalism, it's an offer from the Smith Commission, even if that is put into legislation. So what was offered during these last desperate days of the campaign, when the unionist parties were trying desperately to avoid defeat, is not now what's being matched in the offer that's being made to Scotland. And that's if you take to one side this caveat that's been put on it, look, you can only get this if there are changes in England as well.
But did you ever feel the promises made about devolution would be kept?
Well, I always greet promises from Westminster politicians with a large degree of scepticism, because I've seen them come and go over the years. And my impression, my understanding, my experience tells me that the Westminster will only deliver anything to Scotland when they have no alternative whatsoever. So obviously I put a heavy discount on pledges and commitments, but of course it wasn't really important what I thought about it. What was important was these 10% of swing voters, the people who made the difference between it being a 55-45 for no or a 55-45 for yes. It's that swing 10% of voters, the people who were persuaded that they could vote no and still get these substantial, extensive, near federal powers for Scotland. It was their impression that mattered. And of course, these are the same people now who, in addition to the people who voted yes, are saying, my goodness, these promises are not being redeemed. We're going to vote SNP at the Westminster elections to make absolutely sure that the vow is redeemed in full, that the promises made to Scotland are now delivered.
All right, we're going to take a short break right now. When we come back, we'll continue talking to the man behind Scotland's drive for independence, former First Minister Alex Salmond, about what will happen to the idea of sovereign Scotland in the wake of the referendum loss. Stay with us. We're back with Alex Salmond, former First Minister of Scotland, talking about the prospects of Scottish independence and the mark the movement will leave on the whole of Britain. So, Mr. Salmond, the Smith Commission's recommendations go further than the original vow promised by Gordon Brown. Now, they recommended full instead of part devolution of income tax, alongside significant elements of welfare spending. Why isn't the deal enough? What other powers are missing out of the report?
Well, what Scotland was offered in the last week of the campaign by the Liberal Party was Home Rule, by the newspaper which articulated the vow, the Daily Record, was Devolution Max, as it's called, and by Gordon Brown was Near Federalism. What the Smith Commission has offered is not that. It's not that because Robert Smith, the Lord Smith and chair of the Commission, had to go at the pace of the slowest ship in the convoy, in this case the Labour Party, which is an extremely slow ship to have to go at the pace of. And therefore, what we've been offered is not control of finance. We've been control of finance, 70% of it would remain in London. We've not been offered control of welfare because 80% of that would remain in London. And therefore, what the Smith Commission has offered, even if you assume it's going to be delivered, falls far short of what Scotland was offered during the last week of the campaign. And therefore it's extremely important as we approach the next electoral test in Scotland that the people of Scotland take the opportunity to make sure what was offered, promised to Scotland, is redeemed, and to do that at the ballot box by exercising the right to make sure that enough people from Scotland go down to Westminster to make certain that the promises to Scotland are now delivered.
You know, doommongers say this deal is the beginning of the end for the UK. What if Wales and Northern Ireland ask for more powers as well? What happens then? And do you think they should?
Well, you know, what Wales and Northern Ireland do or don't do is a matter for the people of Wales and Northern Ireland. I mean, my view is that not just Scotland, but Wales and Northern Ireland would benefit from having more powers, as indeed would the English regions. There actually is nothing to be frightened of in terms of the devolution of power. A devolution of power is a good thing. A federal system in many places in the world works extremely well. So this fear that people have in Westminster of concentrating all the economic power in one centre is actually extremely bad. It's extremely bad for London itself, but it's also bad for the whole country. You're far better to distribute power, to allow economic activity to take place much more evenly. But you know, the future of Wales and Northern Ireland is really a matter for the people in these countries. The future of Scotland is my concern, and my concern is that we now make sure that Scotland now has, after the UK general election, the powers that were promised to us during the referendum campaign when these three Westminster parties, the Labour, the Tories, the Liberal Democrats, were desperate up against it, where they thought they were losing Scotland, and therefore promised us the moon. well, that's what they promised. It's now up to us to make sure that is what's delivered.
You know, the Better Together camp has promised the question of Scottish independence won't be raised for another generation. Your successor, Nicola Sturgeon, on the other hand, had promised to put holding another independence referendum on top of our agenda. So who is being realistic here?
Well, I always support my former deputy, my new leader, Nicola Sturgeon. What Nicola Sturgeon has to say is always much to be regarded, and certainly to be regarded rather better than anything a Westminster politician has to say. The point that Nicola's made about this is two things. One, at the coming contest, at the coming general election, this is not going to be a contest about independence for Scotland. The task at the coming general election next May, that's May 2015, is to ensure in Scotland, by electing SNP MPs, and the current opinion polls are very favourable, to make sure that the promises made to Scotland are now delivered. What Nicola has said about future referendum is that these will be determined by the people of Scotland. If the people of Scotland in the future, at some point, vote by majority into the Scottish Parliament, people who want to have another referendum, then they will determine whether another referendum takes place. So the decision on a future referendum is not one for the Better Together campaign or the Westminster parties, or even actually for Nicola Sturgeon or myself. It's a decision that will be made by the Scottish people at their elections to the Scottish Parliament.
You know, the First Minister should represent the whole of Scotland. So does calling a new referendum correspond with people's desire? I mean, with all due respect, they just voted against independence, even though it was a very slight margin.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon does represent all of Scotland, and of course that's what she made clear when she was elected as First Minister. But she's also made the point that the pace at which Scotland proceeds towards independence will be determined by the Scottish people. There is no back door to Scottish independence. There's no way around this. The only circumstances in which Scotland can become independent is firstly that people elect to the Scottish Parliament a majority under proportional representation of people who want to hold a referendum, and thereafter by majority the people of Scotland holding such a referendum and having a yes majority. The timescale of that is in the hands of the Scottish people. Now, if I could just comment on Nicola Sturgeon's first few weeks as First Minister, I think they've been outstandingly successful. Now, you might say, well, of course I would say that because I'm a firm supporter of Nicola Sturgeon. But much more importantly, I think, is the opinion of the Scottish people. And as you know, the SNP have now soared to unprecedented heights in the opinion polls, and we now have almost 100,000 members, perhaps 5 times as many, perhaps more, as any other political party in the whole of Scotland. So more important than my impression of Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister is the impression of the people, and that seems to be a resounding thumbs up.
Can I ask you something? Are there any people close to you, in your family or friends, that don't agree with Scotland's independence and have a different opinion other than yours?
Well, can I just say, my late mother, for many years, who I loved dearly and was one of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. My late mother, for many, many years, was a firm Conservative Party voter in Scotland. But I have to say, in her later years, she decided to vote in the same direction as her husband and her son. So I welcomed her support, but I still loved her as my mother, even when she was voting Conservative.
Now, you say you want the British nuclear armed submarines out of Navy bases in Scotland, but where would they go? Do you propose UK lose its nuclear deterrent?
Well, there's two issues here. One is, if and when Scotland becomes independent, I hope when Scotland becomes independent, then of course the nuclear weapons would have to be moved out of Scotland. Nobody seriously would argue that Scotland as a nation of 5.25 million people should be a nuclear power. As to where they would move, well, it would be up to the rest of the United Kingdom government. There's certainly space in Devonport to base the submarines. They would have an issue about the supply system for the nuclear warheads, but of course there's plenty of facilities elsewhere, in America for example, to do that. My advice to the UK government under these circumstances would be to take the opportunity not to be a nuclear power, but I do accept that is a matter for the rest of the UK. The second issue is the one that's coming up in the next election, and that is during the term of the next Westminster Parliament, a decision will have to be made as to whether to renew the Trident nuclear system, to go for a new generation of nuclear weapons at the cost of some £100 billion over a generation. Now, I think that would be the wrong decision at any time. I think in the atmosphere of a severe financial pressure on budgetary issues in the United Kingdom, that would be the wrong decision to make. I think it's indefensible at a time of austerity when key issues affecting the economy or the social provision for the people are being squeezed, where public service is under pressure, is to sign up for £100 billion of expenditure on a new generation of new submarines and new missiles. That would be a bad decision, and certainly it's one that SNP MPs will do their absolute best to make sure does not happen in the term of the next Westminster Parliament.
Now, you have set your sights on a UK Parliament. Nicola Sturgeon said Westminster is shaking in its boots as a result, but the MPs in Westminster, they feel like they are the winners, and they would look at you as a man who's lost the main battle in his life. So how are you going to go about it?
Well, I've declared my candidature for a constituency in the northeast of Scotland. I'm taking nothing for granted. I expect a hard fight in that constituency, particularly against the Conservative Party. But I note the bookies, the bookmakers, have me as a strong favourite in that constituency. But as a favourite in the constituency, I'll have to work extremely hard to gain the support of the people. But it's not really a question just of securing that election. It's a question of how many SNP MPs are returned across Scotland. Current indications are that could be a substantial number. If it is a substantial number, then that block of MPs, along with allies in the Green Party and from Wales, could have a substantial influence in the next UK Parliament. And if that happens, of course, then I think it is the case that Nicola Sturgeon will be right, that the Westminster parties, the Tories, Labour, the Liberals, will be shaking in their boots. And they have reasonable cause to be shaking in their boots.
Right, so the Tories have promised to start working on a British EU exit referendum if the next election allows them to do so. Why are you so against leaving the EU? I mean, last time we spoke, you even told me that independence means control over finances and resources. I mean, does anyone in the EU have control over their finances?
Well, yes, they do. I mean, there's a distinction, of course, between the European Union and being part of the euro area. The European Union has a substantial trading relationship, but being a country in the European Union still gives you control of 99% of your taxation, everything except the VAT contribution. Obviously, restrictions come in if you're part of the euro currency as well, but nonetheless, taxation is under the control of individual countries. And it should be said that many countries in Northern Europe in particular find great benefits from that relationship. So I don't think you want to say, look, here we want changes within the European Union. We'd like the European Union to be more progressive in social policy, for example. And therefore the answer to our wish for change in the European Union is to withdraw from it entirely and to abandon the close trading and political relationship that we've developed over these last 39 years. I think that would be a ridiculous position to adopt, but that is the position that's being adopted by many people in the Conservative Party and in UKIP south of the border. It's not a position that's shared in Scotland.
Mr. Salmond, thank you very much for this interview. We wish you best of luck with all your future undertakings. We're talking to former First Minister of Scotland, the man behind the Scottish independence movement, Alex Salmond, talking about his future plans and where Scotland stands after the referendum. That's it for this edition of Sophie & Co. I'll see you next time. Thank you, Mr. Salmond.
And Merry Christmas to all your viewers.
Thank you. Merry Christmas to you too.